moving on to energy now, and an article from Connor Tomlinson. I wonder who that guy is.
Yeah. Oh, okay, yeah. So basically what happened was there's a company called NuScale. They're an American nuclear power company. And during COP26 in November 2021, Scotland, we weren't allowed in the main hall. We were allowed in part of it, but we weren't allowed in the main UN chamber because they had vaccine passport and some of us weren't. So we just hosted mostly fringe events, particularly with most of I spoke to a guy who did wave power off the coast of Scotland, and they were making leaps and bounds, which is something the UK could
Making
actually
waves
do.
even. Sorry.
But it's far better than solar for the UK to use. It makes more sense because it's weather dependent.
We don't have any sunlight in Britain.
That would be an amazing point to raise with the UK government, but there you go. Liz Truss tried that, and look what happened to her. The American company signed a teaming agreement with a Romanian energy company called, and this is really hard to pronounce, but Societatea Națională.
Societete? I don't know.
You really are leaning into Italian roots. Nuclear Electricità SA, so SNNSA, that's far easier to say. And they're developing a 6-module, 462 megawatt power plant in Romania. And it's a small modular reactor, which means that you can have more of them. They're easier deployed. And as the technology increases, they're more cost effective and their life cycle will be longer. And you can update technology within them far better. Because part of the problem is with nuclear power plants is that by the time you've commissioned them, the decade it takes to develop, there are not only new regulations which you need to continually update the budget to make sure you comply with, but there's also new tech coming out at the same time. So you need to make alterations, and so you need to test that the tech is incorporated with it. And sometimes if you incorporate the tech from overseas and you have different safety regulations, then there's a bit of an issue there because loads of them they get their parts from China, their plant plans from South Korea, and loads of the stuff is also made in America. And so because you've all got different specifications and testing requirements, it can mean that if you're deploying these nuclear reactors in different countries, you can come up with issues. There was one nuclear reactor in the States that was built badly. And to be fair, nuclear power, most people think of Chernobyl, Fukushima, 2 Mile Island, incredibly rare, ridiculous, especially because more people die falling off the roofs, fitting solar panels, or just working in coal plants anyway than have ever died from a nuclear disaster. But what happened was one of the American ones is it wasn't done properly, and the casket that contained the water that was being boiled to turn the turbines by the nuclear power, there was a hole in it the size of an American football, and if it would have leaked, it would have gone into some form of meltdown, not a explosion as you would think the mushroom cloud, but it just would have been totally defunct. So you've got to be careful the amount of stuff that you put into this. But the SMRs are a much better technology. They're roll-outable, almost like prefabs, across different countries, and they provide entirely carbon neutral. Whether or not that's going to be an issue down the road is debatable, but marketed to these kind of clowns at least. Long life cycle energy for relatively cost-effective means, and if you can get the government to change the way in which they fund nuclear power plants to be more market-focused than to be funded by the taxpayer, so they don't have to foot the bill for those upgrades, those safety requirements over the 10-year life cycle, then it means that you get really cost-effective energy within a decade and your bills will just halve. And that's great stuff.
That's always good to hear. And that's quite a lot of information there as well.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. No, it's good to know. I mean, I've actually learnt something.
Well, the UK government did once listen to me. So they did the UK Nuclear Financing Bill of 2020, and it was 2022. And it was passed in 2022, I think. Yeah, it had to have been because I did the update for it. Anyway, so I did a paper with the Adam Smith Institute called It's Easy Being Green, which I think, considering we sent it to a bunch of MPs and the PM a couple of months before he did his UN speech and he made the Kermit the Frog reference, that may have actually been my fault. I might have accidentally reminded Boris Johnson of Kermit the Frog, so that's my bad. But my suggestion to change from, I think it was a feed-in tariffs to regulated asset-based model. It means that rather than the government guaranteeing a certain proportion of the loan while you're building the power plant for 10 years, and then when costs go up, they have to look elsewhere, usually getting funding from the likes of Chinese General Nuclear for Hinkley and Bradwell, because their state-owned nuclear firm has a 33 and 22% investment in those plants respectively. Not at all concerned that the Chinese own most of our nuclear infrastructure. And we're also still committed to building like a £500 million joint venture on UK soil with the Chinese government. Absolutely nuts.
I don't understand how they do that, because that's just like, yes, one of our main political opponents. Let's just get them in on our nuclear power plants.
Yeah, exactly. So in a sane society, this is the legislation that I proposed, and they've adopted it. It's just frustrating where the energy companies are going because they're adopting renewables rather than oil and gas, which you could do with carbon capture and just neutralize the emissions and then sell on the carbon as a product. But anyway, whatever. What I said instead is, rather than the government guaranteeing it with taxpayer-funded loans, what you do is you give a tax break to the companies for investing in the nuclear power plant's development life cycle. They've got the more liquid capital available to invest in the upgrades as it goes along, and they can surcharge a slight bump, presuming that they get their energy from abundant sources like oil and gas in the meantime, so it isn't as expensive as it is today, to the consumers who are paying for their services. So you would pay 10% extra on your bills at basically a static rate for 10 years, and then after that 10 years, because you're still on the same tariff, it would then basically halve because the amount of energy is so abundant. We'd be like France, where they're a net energy exporter and they're earning billions for their treasury and companies. And that's why EDF just blow us out of the water. So they adopted that. Great idea. And then they just doubled down on renewables. Very annoying.
I know. It's almost like we don't want to copy the French out of pride.
I think
there might be an element of that somewhere.
I just think it's a purposeful demolition of our energy security.
That is true,
having read so many government papers at this point, there are just so many glaring arrows. It's like when they did a reforestation policy and there was no mention of forest fire prevention for the entire policy proposal. And it's like, right, so you guys, you're either so all incompetent in Whitehall that hundreds of researchers did not notice this, or you're just rushing things through for ideology.
I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the people making the policy hadn't seen a tree that hadn't been planted by a human hand before.
True.
So moving on to some more energy stuff, nuclear fusion and the recent breakthrough. This was only in December, so you might have heard this by the time it's gone out. So it says, US scientists have reached a major milestone in their attempts to perfect a process which could potentially deliver almost limitless supplies of energy. Nuclear fission produces a lot of radioactive waste which can be dangerous and must be stored safely, potentially for hundreds of years. The waste product by nuclear fusion is less radioactive and decays much more quickly. Nuclear fusion doesn't need fossil fuels like oil or gas. It doesn't generate greenhouse gases, which traps the sun's heat and are responsible for climate change, according to the BBC. Most fusion experiments use hydrogen, which can be extracted cheaply from seawater, and lithium, meaning fuel supplies could last for millions of years. It has been described as the holy grail of energy production.
So I will be critical as to the framing because nuclear fission doesn't produce that much nuclear waste.
Yes, they're being a little bit climate activisty, aren't they? This is the BBC, so...
The overwhelming majority is just irradiated clothing, which you obviously get by working in the power plants. Actually, most power plants' background radiation levels are lower than that of the state of Colorado, and Colorado has one of the lowest cancer rates in all of the US. So, and lots of background radiation is actually good for you. But there is I know that there are some reactors, small modular reactors, that are actually recycling nuclear waste to be the fuel in them because you need less to power them. So that would basically neutralize a nuclear energy issue, nuclear waste issue rather. And there's, I think it's in Iceland or Finland, where they're lifting up the tectonic plate, the crust of the Earth, and trying to bury the nuclear waste under there so it basically dissipates at a similar level of radiation. It's completely harmless to us. So those are all solid ways of dispensing with that. And in the meantime, it means we should be building fission reactors. But when we actually crack fusion, it's going to be totally waste neutral. The fuel's going to be far more abundant than uranium, and it's not going to be sourced from countries like Russia or Ukraine, either of which we've pissed off or are currently being engaged in a war. And so it's going to make everything energy abundant and very energy secure for relatively little cost. It's fantastic.
It's just about making it a net, what's the word? As in making it produce a positive amount of energy, isn't it? Rather than there being a deficit. So that's very promising as well.
There was a recent thing where, I think I've got it. So hang on. UK's Culham Centre for Fusion broke records on energy extraction. This was February of last year now, 2022. The JET experiments produced 59 megajoules of energy over 5 seconds. That's 11 megawatts of power, so enough to boil 60 kettles. And then the Livermore National Laboratory in California did enough energy to power a smoke detector in January. I think this actually might be the place that did the breakthrough, the Livermore one in California, for this particular bit. Because if this happened in December, then I think it's the same one. So we're seeing it actually come leaps and bounds from before they had enough power as a battery to now can be proclaimed as a fair breakthrough.
60 cups of tea isn't exactly small, is it? I mean, just to put that into context, the power grid has to accommodate for people boiling kettles at half time in football games in England. Well, I imagine the whole of the UK, actually.
Yeah.
So I remember visiting, I think it was a natural gas power plant when I was doing my physics A-level, and I think it was a Centrica one. But they were saying that they actually had a notable spike, and it was always predictable. So they actually had to, as part of their job, watch the football. They were like, oh, there are harder things to do.
Well, I went to Whitley, which is the largest onshore, it was formerly in Europe, I think they've built a new one in Romania, but at least in the UK, largest onshore wind farm in Scotland, in the Highlands, beautiful place. And I was talking to the engineers, and some of the things they said were rather eye-opening, because my suspicions were confirmed by the people that should be most pro-wind power. They said a lot of the time, because the schematics and parts are transported from Spain and China by shipping container, the cost of energy it takes to make the wind turbines is never made back, nor is the carbon made back, because it's coated in carbon fiber. If it ever freezes up, you need to get in a helicopter and de-ice it with a flamethrower or a jet wash. It's utterly impractical. And then they said you need a dispatchable base load, at least in the meantime, which means that during peak usage hours, you can turn it on or off and decrease the energy, and also be able to store it, because currently renewables can't be stored. I did the maths on this, but I'll go into another time. You need something like nuclear or liquid natural gas to generate excess of energy when needed and safeguard against troughs and deficits, because worst case scenario, if the backup generators in the hospital fail and then the mainline power goes out, well, they're all the people off of life support. Not good.
I actually spoke to someone who maintained wind turbines, and he said that he's on really good money to basically go up and give them a clean, and it's also really dangerous. So it makes the cost of running them quite expensive, because the people who have to do it have to be paid relative to the danger, and they have a fair amount of training as well.
Well, I can't remember which oil it uses, but the actual turbines themselves to grease their parts do use a fossil fuel. So
it's ridiculous, isn't it? So I think we're going to skip over this next one, because we've been talking about that, and on to this one, which is a new heat engine with no moving parts is as efficient as a steam turbine. So that might not mean very much to you, but when I read a little bit of this, it shall become clear why this is good. So engineers at MIT, they've clearly had a busy year, and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL, have designed a heat engine with no moving parts. Their new demonstration shows that it converts heat to electricity with over 40% efficiency, a performance better than that of traditional steam turbines. The heat engine is a thermophotovoltaic cell, similar to a solar panel's photovoltaic cells, that passively captures high-energy photons from a white-hot heat source and converts them into electricity. The team's design can generate electricity from a heat source between 1,900 to 2,400 degrees Celsius, or up to about 4,300 degrees Fahrenheit. So
that's fantastic for renewables generation capacity. The problem you have with renewables is that there's not going to be any backup battery technology for quite a few years. So when I looked into this, we used Tesla's Hornsdale facility in Australia, because that's the largest battery capacity facility in the world currently. And we did some modeling, and this was from the pre-inflation numbers. This was based on 2020's grid generation numbers. So the modelling needs to be updated. Happy to be corrected if anyone wants to go and do that far better than I did. So a nuclear engineer and I went in and saw, okay, for the rate of generation for nuclear power and the amount of cost it would take to replicate the Hornsdale facilities, how much would it cost us and how much energy would we get if Britain were to go fully renewable in 2021? And we found out that it would need the world's battery manufacturing capacity to stop, 82% of which is provided by China, and be entirely redirected to the UK just for the grid. So that all the rare minerals and all that sort of stuff. From now until 2031, it would cost 2.9 trillion at the time, which is larger than the UK's entire GDP. And even then, it would only meet 26.5% of energy demands with no contingencies for outages. And the longest
absolute
outage,
insanity.
Yeah, the
isn't
longest outage was 21 days.
it?
So it's not a viable plan until we figure out how we can actually store this sort of stuff. And at least we need to combine it with a dispatchable baseload like nuclear or gas. One of the ways they've actually conceived of storing solar power is, you know, the pig crap silo in The Simpsons?
Of course.
They want to fill that all up with sand, superheat the sand constantly with all the leftover solar radiation, and then funnel it back. The problem is, of course, during the transfer, you lose a lot of energy, so it's really inefficient. So unless they can crack battery technology, it's not really worth adopting renewables yet. Won't stop the government, though.
I knew they weren't very efficient, but I didn't realise they were that inefficient.
Yeah, upwards of 3 trillion now.
That's ridiculous.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.